Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last night, the Deputy First Minister was forced to admit to this Parliament that the UK COVID inquiry sent a request to the Scottish Government for messages related to the pandemic in February of this year. But last week, the Deputy First Minister claimed the request was made just over a month ago. First Minister, those two statements are clearly contradictory. So how can they both be true?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, the Deputy First Minister was clear in her statement, and you can check the official record for this, of course, when she made her statement last week. She did mention that there was initial requests from the inquiry. In terms of my own response to Anna Sawar, I, of course, was talking about a very particular issue around specific WhatsApp groups. But let me be clear. Let me be absolutely
Let's hear
clear
the First Minister,
that
members.
I fully accept that the Scottish Government clearly interpreted the requests from the inquiry in a way that was too narrow, and for any shortcomings on our behalf that
Let's
have
hear
caused
the First
any
Minister, please.
For any shortcomings on our behalf that has caused any distress to the families of those who have been bereaved by COVID, then I apologise unreservedly, as I did last week, and I reiterate and re-emphasise that apology this week. What we have done on the back, of course, of the request from the inquiry have ensured that the Government has released 14,000 messages to the inquiry, and when it comes to my own witness statement, that includes reams of WhatsApp messages unredacted. That is, of course, Presiding Officer, in very stark contrast to a Prime Minister who not only dragged the inquiry through courts, but has refused to hand over his own WhatsApp messages.
Douglas Ross.
This is the third week I've raised this at First Minister's questions, and it's... Well, if the SNP don't like it, I don't think they would have liked the First Minister's attempt at an excuse there, because the First Minister peddled the same false claims as the Deputy First Minister. Let's be very clear what he said to this chamber last week. Humza Yousaf said, and I quote, "The messages were asked for in September, just a matter of weeks ago." That's what he said, black and white in the official record. But back in February, the UK COVID inquiry asked for, and I quote, "internal and external emails, text messages or WhatsApp messages held by the Scottish Government." The evidence is clear. Will he admit that in last week's session he didn't tell the truth?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I absolutely refute that. I told and have told the Chamber that, of course, they can check the official record. Clearly, I was talking about specific WhatsApp groups. Where I do accept fully from the inquiry is that we have interpreted their requests too narrowly, and subsequently, having done so,
hear the First
we have
Minister.
then supplied 14,000 messages to the inquiry. In my witness statement, I have, of course, handed over the WhatsApp messages that I have unredacted to the inquiry, in very stark contrast to a UK Government that took the inquiry to court, lost that court battle, and the Prime Minister refuses to hand over his WhatsApp messages. So, once again, I say to Douglas Ross, we don't fear scrutiny. I suspect his party absolutely does.
Douglas Ross.
That's a very brave answer from the First Minister when his predecessor and others in government have been deleting messages, running away from scrutiny. But let's look very carefully, because the First Minister seems to be struggling with this, as to what was said last week. The Deputy First Minister told Parliament it has been just over a month since messages were requested. The First Minister claimed in this chamber the messages were asked for in September, just a matter of weeks ago. That is what was said. That is in the official record of this Parliament. The two most senior people in the Scottish Government stated that the UK COVID inquiry only requested the messages in September. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It wasn't an honest mistake. It was deliberate. Now the UK COVID inquiry, tasked with getting answers for grieving families, has had to demand the SNP comes to this Parliament to tell the truth about the timeline of when the requests were made. So why did Humza Yousaf and the SNP make these false claims?
First Minister.
I would urge Douglas Ross to once again read the statement from the Deputy First Minister, which of course says in black and white, well, if Douglas Ross has, he will see in black and white that the Deputy First Minister references initial requests. It is entirely understandable and of course appropriate for the inquiry to ask us to then provide the absolute full context of requests, which we did without any hesitation, without arguing back with the inquiry, to ensure that we were transparent and accountable. Now, I understand why Douglas Ross wants to obsess about process. We've, of course, handed over the 14,000 messages. I've handed over reams of WhatsApp messages from myself, and I absolutely acknowledge the distress that has been caused to families that have been bereaved by COVID and apologise unreservedly to them. And while the process is important, the substance of those messages are important too. And what I can say with total confidence, even though I have not seen some of the messages, of course, from individual witnesses, what I can say with total confidence is there was not a single Scottish Government minister that said, "Let the bodies pile up high," presiding officer. That, of course, presiding officer.
Thank you.
That, of course, presiding officer, was none other than Boris Johnson, a man that Douglas Ross served under in government, a man that Douglas Ross, of course, defended to the hilt, a man that Douglas Ross claimed was honest. Douglas Ross should be ashamed of himself for his defence of Boris Johnson.
Douglas Ross.
Humza Yousaf should not just be ashamed of himself for that answer, but the way he is treating this Parliament with contempt and the families of grieving victims. Let us be very clear. The UK COVID inquiry repeatedly asked the SNP government for WhatsApp messages. They asked if the messages existed last year. They asked for the messages themselves in February of this year, and again in March, and in July, and in August. But the First Minister and Deputy First Minister claim none of this ever happened. They have been caught red-handed in a cover-up. They knowingly told this chamber statements that were false. Isn't it beyond doubt that Humza Yousaf and Shona Robison misled this Parliament?
First Minister.
Not the case, presiding officer. And I would refer Douglas Ross once again to the official record, where the Deputy First Minister, in black and white, talks about initial requests. What I absolutely fully accept is that, as a government, we interpreted those requests too narrowly. What we have done to take corrective action is to make sure we submitted 14,000 messages. What I have done, of course, is made sure that I have handed over the messages that I have in unredacted form. But let's not take away from the substance instead of the process issues that Douglas Ross, of course, is so obsessed with. We had this week Simon Case describing working in Boris Johnson's government as taming wild animals. That, of course, was a government that Douglas Ross was a member of. I can't even read out the messages that Dominic Cumming handed to the inquiry. However, we heard from that inquiry. We heard Douglas Ross won't want to hear this. I can understand why he's trying to shout it down. But, Presiding Officer, this is an exceptionally important point. In the inquiry in the last couple of weeks, we have heard there was a deliberate attempt by the UK government to exclude devolved governments from decision-making. And, of course, during the early days of the pandemic, Douglas Ross was a minister within the Scotland office. Did he purposely try to exclude devolved administrations and, indeed, this government from decision-making? So at a time when people needed, right across the UK, serious leadership, during a serious time, they had wild animals, according to Simon Case, running the UK government.